Okay. So we have been working with SLCN here at NeighborWorks to, is my screen shown?
Yeah.
Okay. To put together their website. And so it's officially done. It launched last night. And so, yeah, it's a really neat, simple website. So feel free to check it out. I will put the link to this in the chat. But what's really cool about this website is since all community councils are, or any group that is registered under the community organizations through Salt Lake City is a member technically. So we were able to add this cool feature for our members that lists all of your guys's organizations. And if you click on one, let's just look at Ballpark. We put a little bit of information in there about like when you meet, so that way this can kind of be another place for you guys to put information for community members who might be interested in getting more information about a certain community council or group. The nice thing about this is that you guys are all members, and there is a feature on here where you guys can list your meetings or events and you can submit them for free. It doesn't cost anything. And so, yeah, so all of our events or anything like that for SLCN will be here too. And then we have a resource page too, so that way you can see the new and improved guidebook, and you can download it if you like, or if you just want to flip through it online, you can also do that. And it's got this really cool like flippy page thing. And then if you're looking for, like if you missed a meeting and you want to see the recording of it, you can watch them here. So it's really cool. It's a really cool website. I really like it. I think the web developer that we worked with did a really great job, and it's really simple. And we're in process, and I'll probably send a survey out to you guys next week, just to get some information about what you guys as community councils would need if we were to add, like, if you needed a website, we could add like a page on here for you. So we're looking into that. But so after this meeting, all of the community council chairs will receive an email letting you know to just come and claim your listing, as you guys saw on the SLCN member side. And that way you can create a login and then post any events, meetings, update any content that's on your listing that you want. So yeah, that is the website.
Awesome, thank you. So we'll just get going. So welcome to the monthly SLCN meeting. I wanted to thank Dennis Ferris again for overseeing the SLCN for the past few years. Wish him luck in his new gig. I'm Landon with the Sugar House Community Council. Gonna try to keep this boat going for a while. So just a reminder, we're gonna take a break in July. We'll be back in August where we'll hear from a presentation on the inland port. And then in September and October, we're hoping to invite all city council candidates to come give a 2 or 3 minute talk about whatever they want to talk about. We're always open for agenda topics, so please reach out if you have some ideas to Jasmine or I or Ellen or Dorothy. So we'll just get right to our presenter. So it's going to be Andrew Johnston. He's formerly District 2 City Council and currently the Director of Homelessness Policy and Outreach for the Mayor's Office. Just a reminder to be courteous to the speakers. We'll have a good discussion. So Andrew.
Thanks. I don't have a formal presentation, so I apologize if that's going to let anyone down and they want to exit early. I've been here before. We've talked a few times. I'm more than happy to take a lot of questions and just open dialogue if that would be the most helpful, but maybe I'll set things up a little bit about where we've been from the city perspective, where I'm sort of jumping in kind of midstream, I guess, and some thoughts about where we're headed, I hope. The first piece of this is that Salt Lake City has been working within the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness for a number of years. David Litvak, the mayor, mayors plural, have served on I think the steering committee, the Shelter the Homeless Board, the State Homeless Council now, they've been involved for a number of years in that way, because we say this is a statewide issue, it's a countywide issue, and it is. So we're not new to the discussions. To set up how we fit in, perhaps, the state just passed a reorganization last year of state homeless services. And y'all know that Wayne Niederhauser, former president of the Senate, was appointed to be the statewide coordinator for homeless services. So he works within the state level department within the governor's office of management, and it used to be management and budget, it's management and something else now. And he's sort of the coordinator at that level about the entire state. And the state's made up of 13 of these local areas that each have responsibility to oversee their homeless services for that area and their needs. And so really the state has a plan, but the plan is made up of each of the 13 areas giving their input of what they need to see done and what they need perhaps from the state or feds or anyone else to make it happen. Locally, that means Salt Lake County is its own local homeless coordinating council. And Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness is that council, is that entity. And that's made up of anybody who has any interest at all in these issues. And so citizens, policymakers, nonprofits, those who are homeless or have formerly been homeless, anyone at all who's interested in any area involving this can join that group. It also has a steering committee, which I'm a part of at this point, which tries to manage and coordinate all the small groups working on different issues together to get a coherent plan to present to the state, along with budget needs and those kind of things. So that's how that organization within the state works. Now, Salt Lake City is a part of that local homeless coordinating county, the coalition. And so we're working to be a part of that in their planning process. Salt Lake County has about 3,000 individuals at any one point in time who are unsheltered or in a shelter right now who don't have permanent housing. And the number is much larger than that on a yearly basis, at least twice that, I think. But about 60% of the folks who come into shelters, for instance, come in for a short amount of time and then leave and don't come back into the system. If you looked in all the data from the state, you'd find a lot of names that show up once, maybe twice for short amounts of time and never show up again. What you have generally from a public perspective is a smaller number of folks who are chronically homeless or in the centers day in, day out, who are on the streets camping. They're sort of the face of homelessness, but they're not really the bulk of the number of folks we see who are homeless, if that makes sense. So when we talk about homelessness in Salt Lake City, generally we talk a lot about that group that is very visible and seems to be growing as well during COVID. But the homeless planning has taken into account all of the other folks. And that means there's a lot of children who are homeless, who are generally in families that are doubled up or tripled up in housing, sometimes in the family shelter, sometimes in transitional options or other programs. That's a large number of folks. We also know that the biggest single group of those who are homeless in the state and in the country actually are baby boomers. And that makes sense demographically. We just never think about it that way, that they just age through and up that process. And so a lot of the services that are needed right now for homelessness are not necessarily the young single people we see on the street, single adults. They're really seniors who generally have higher needs for medical care. They have hospitalizations at higher rates. They have prescription needs. They've got different sort of physical living needs in shelter or in housing. I'm not sure we're quite sort of caught up to that need at this point, but it's clearly identified about the need for more of that sort of senior housing as it relates to homelessness. So that brings us probably to where the city has been during COVID, which is really seeing an uptick in the number of folks who are unsheltered and camping or in shelters in and out. Traditionally, in the last 2.5 years, since we've had the Geraldine King Women's Shelter open and the other two open up shortly afterwards, we've been running at those shelters about 90 to 95% capacity pretty consistently. Generally, what you'd see in a shelter is based on weather, you'd see ups and downs and based on time of the month. So colder months, bad weather, shelters are more full. The warmer months, as long as it's not too hot, and mild weather, you'd see the numbers drop a little bit. You'd also see in those shelters that numbers would drop at the beginning of the month. When there are folks who have a fixed income who get their checks at the beginning of the month, and they'll generally sort of parlay those together with other folks and find other options temporarily. Generally within a week, they'd come back into the shelters as well. So oftentimes they'd go into motels or find other places to stay temporarily while their check is still, they still have money in their account, so to speak. So there's cycles we see in that way. What we've seen the last winter and the summer is slightly different. And what we've seen there is that, number one, COVID changed a lot of the dynamics of what we're seeing out there. Traditionally, folks would gather in larger camps or in shelters or congregate settings, and we would handle it in those groups, those sort of economies of scale concept, right? It's cheaper for a large number of folks to be taken care of in one place. COVID best practices were spread out as much as possible. So the resource centers are still running at high capacity, but they had to move beds everywhere they could in those buildings to get social distancing, especially at night. So instead of having 5 dorms on that first floor of Geraldine, they used the entire upstairs as much as possible, any open space they could possibly find to spread people out throughout the building. And they've been doing that for over a year and a half now. And it changes the whole dynamic of that building, how you operate, how you offer services, how the staff manages things, those kind of issues. The positive sign there has been that the rate of transmittance of COVID or that virus has been very low in those buildings. There's been some outbreaks, but sometimes there's a perception that that's been a sort of breeding ground for COVID transmission. It hasn't been at all. They've also been a great place for frequent testing, and in vaccination efforts, it's been this sort of the high point there as well. So those centers are working phenomenally well, considering the situation we're in. What we've seen is a mild winter combined with a lot of activist groups who have been trying to give support to them, allowing for larger camps that keep flourishing throughout the city. And combination of factors about why they're here. They've always been in Salt Lake, more or less. Services, sort of places to be, those kind of things. It's also been true that for quite a long time that other municipalities have not been delivering services to the homeless individuals. And so there's a combination of not being welcome anywhere else and not getting services there, but also at times being actively harassed elsewhere. And so the city has had a no camping ordinance, but COVID made that difficult based on best practices, and the sheer volume of people we've got led to a battle between, if you force them out of every jurisdiction, we have a problem. There's no place to go, literally. In the past, what happened, to be honest with y'all, is that the old road home shelter downtown on Rio Grande Street was built for about 400 plus people, give or take, depending on when they expanded. But they would flex as big as 1,100 people some nights in the wintertime, meaning literally people were sleeping in every floor they could find, hallways, alcoves, doorways, anywhere in that facility to get inside, which was a phenomenal job in doing that. It also sort of masked the real need out there. If they had been held to the same conditional use restrictions that the new centers have, where you cannot exceed a certain number of people, period, no matter what, we would have seen similar things probably in previous years out on the streets. And so the numbers are up during this year, as far as we can tell. They haven't released them from the state yet, but the point in time count numbers have shown a higher number of folks. The outreach teams from Volunteers of America have seen an increase in first-time people they're seeing. They haven't seen them before, which says that probably a combination of COVID and other factors are bringing more people out. And they're more visible because there's just not a clear overflow outside of the wintertime. This past wintertime, what happened was, because the centers couldn't exceed their 200 bed capacity period, we were able to get the winter funding we traditionally have to do motel rooms for the most part. And that meant the airport inn at the end of North Temple on the West End, about 150 people were there. We had COVID, had a quarantine and isolation facility the county run, which could flex pretty high as well. We had a vulnerable populations motel for folks who were in the shelters, who were over 55, had underlying health conditions, folks who would have had much more serious complications had they gotten COVID. They were moved there for the wintertime, and that was about 120 beds in that facility. So we also had other beds we've used year in, year out for women's kind of scattered motel sites. We used a lot of COVID money, stimulus money, to pay for those through the county and the health department, and the city helped a fair amount on that. And that's how we handled the wintertime, but that was always one-time temporary money that expired, generally in April every year. So we were able to expand from April to June, but as of June, the money's gone. There's not money to fund those services during the summertime. So we do see an increase of folks leaving the motels, and we don't have a corresponding increase in beds in the resource centers. Our best guesses right now are we're probably about 300 beds short, give or take. Now, you may try and go out and do a head count of folks who are on the streets if you see them camping, and you may count more people potentially, or more tents, depending on how thorough you are. Not everybody in those communities is always homeless or has no place else to go. But based on the numbers we've seen this year, literal numbers from point in time from the shelters and the capacity things we track, we think there's about 300 beds we need. Meaning even if we filled up every single bed in the shelters every night and every other resource we've got, we would still be short. Now, ultimately the answer is housing. This is a housing problem at its fundamental core. But if we can't get housing quickly, we got to find another option. And so there's been a lot of discussion, and you probably have heard this or been part of those discussions about, is it better to have scattered camps, which we're doing now, essentially to try and keep the camps smaller so you don't get that aggregating issue going on, or have to sanction camp someplace in the city or somewhere else, a place where you could legally go for some amount of time and keep it reasonably safe and hygienic, et cetera. It's a difficult dilemma, mostly because during COVID, the CDC recommended small camps scattered as much as possible. And we see a really, really mixed experience across the country on sanctioned camps. There are very few that operate really, really well. The rationale really is it's probably in the same neighborhood cost to do a sanctioned camp with the required hygiene issues, security issues, the staffing you need, because you still need intake and things in those camps, as it would be to have a full-time indoor place you could use year round. And so the Salt Lake Valley Coalition has said, based on best practices nationwide, they would recommend strongly having another indoor option, whether it's temporary or year round. That's, if we're going to spend the money on something, spend it on that versus a sanctioned camp that we can use during relatively moderate sort of weather months, but may not be functional in the wintertime, and we're still gonna have the same problem because we use all the money on that. It's a difficult dilemma. We're still dealing with it internally at the city. And we can talk more about that if you're interested in talking through the pros and cons and issues. The complicating factors this year, which are a little new perhaps than previous years. One is that the fire danger is so high that traditionally a lot of folks would go camp in the foothills, particularly above Victory Road. That's just not feasible this year. It's too high a risk in a lot of ways, along with other sort of dry areas of the city. So one area people would go if they weren't in downtown or in the neighborhoods would be there. That's probably not an option we're working on right now. The second one is the volume of people moving to the Jordan River is so high that from the county health department perspective, the Jordan River is a major environmental problem right now. Probably top on their list just from a county health perspective. And so you kind of see if people are going to disappear into the bushes, so to speak, in the city, those are not really good options this year at all. I don't think they're ever great options, but particularly this year, it makes it harder. So that's that piece. I'm setting up sort of difficulties now, just so y'all feel like it's depressing. There's a second piece that is a different group that you may see or hear about in your community councils, which are car camping and RV camping. And this doesn't get talked about a lot in sort of the general discussion, but within West Valley and Salt Lake particularly, there's a lot of this going on in a scattered way. You'll see some of it combining in certain areas, 17 South, West Industrial area, in the different places in the city, maybe one or two. But we've got a lot of those folks as well. And from a homeless service provider perspective, they don't see themselves as homeless the same way as somebody's camping is. Oftentimes they've got jobs, sometimes they're itinerant, they're moving around a fair amount, or they see themselves as just temporarily between housing options, right? For whatever reason, they don't engage in services almost ever. The outreach teams have a hard time engaging them at all because they're just not interested, period. They may get sort of said, you can't stay here more than 48 hours per this parking ordinance, and they'll move around the block or somewhere else, or they'll move during the daytime. But that's a different sort of issue that we're looking at separately than the other camping issue, because those folks technically are not homeless by federal definitions because the car, the camper, even though they probably end up homeless when it breaks down, they can't move it. But it also ends up being a longer term sort of housing option in some places. We saw best practices we've seen were out of Oregon during the wildfires, when the county up there actually had a campground, a KOA kind of concept, and they turned that exclusively into temporary housing for folks who were displaced in their cars or RVs. They had all the hookups, the water, the power, they had hygiene stuff, bathrooms. So it's worked really well, but it ends up being a long-term deal, multiple years. So that's sort of, we're considering that and having discussions internally about how to set that up best ways. It also means you're in it for the long haul, probably. So 2 different groups. That's sort of what we're looking at right now and some of the dilemmas we've got. Now, from a positive end, to go that way for you for a minute, if you read a lot about homelessness in particularly the Western United States and metropolitan areas, Denver, Boise, us, Phoenix, West Coast, obviously, you're going to hear much, much higher numbers than we're talking about here. We have about a million, little more than a million people in Salt Lake County, and we probably have about 3,000 people in the system we serve regularly, right? Of them, right now, we have about a gap of 300 beds to get people at least into a shelter of some sort so we can work on the housing, which is another discussion we can have. So I'm not talking 5,000 or 10,000, which you'll see in San Diego, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, et cetera, 20,000 in some places. We're talking about, I need 300. And 300 would get enough bed capacity so we could clean up camps and they'd have a place to be. Now, whether that's in a motel, what we've done before in this wintertime, congregate shelter, housing, whatever it is, I'm not sort of fallen in love with any particular thing, because right now we need something. But that's sort of the scale we're talking about. So oftentimes we'll have a lot of discussions and people will come in about, we set up something like they've done in San Diego with a big tent, a semi-permanent sort of tent piece, 300 beds, you do the services, et cetera, or sanctioned campground. We've had that in various areas. Literally down, if you've been to Old Town Portland, Oregon, they've had a permanent camp in a city block for a decade plus, 20 years now. It's just been sort of okay. I don't want us to get to that point in the city. I think we're close enough where we could get to a place of being able to not have people have to camp for their subsistence outside, at least the majority of them, or a large majority of them. So in that vein, working with Shelter the Homeless, 4th Street Medical Clinic, because they have some particular medical needs for a large portion of these folks, actively trying to figure out a plan to get those beds as soon as possible, both immediately during the summertime if we can, but especially coming into wintertime again, we need a better option we've done the last few years. It's been sort of make it up as you go, last minute things, a crisis comes on, we can't find any options for 6 to 8 months, and we find something at the last minute to make it work during the wintertime. We're trying to avoid that. I think it harms everybody to do that, and it's lack of consistency that hurts the system because it's hard to get people into housing in that way. So that's the emergency shelter piece immediately we need. The housing piece is a different discussion, deeper related. Housing, the estimated need by the coalition is about 3,000 units, 2,950 or something like that. That's below 40% median income housing across the entire county that's really focused on sheltered or unsheltered, those are experiencing homelessness. Housing costs, as you know, are astronomical. Just to build housing right now, the Magnolia, which just had its ribbon cutting this week, downtown, the old public services block, 65 apartments, for those who are chronically homeless, on-site support and case management, permanent supportive housing. That cost about $280,000 per unit, I believe, to build new. Now I want to say that again. I think it cost about $280,000 for every one of those apartments. Based on labor costs, construction material costs, the whole gamut you know about. That's even with the city sort of having contribute land. It is phenomenally expensive to build new right now. And so we've got that dilemma. And then we've got, if we take motels and rehab them, which the Airport Inn is doing this summer, it's probably going to cost them, they're guessing $80,000 per unit just to rehab a basic motel room, windows, upgrades and some flooring stuff, clean it, those kind of things. So the average in there is we're thinking about $160,000 per unit. If you say we need about 3,000 of those, you're talking about north of $415 million to do that. Now that's not going to happen, at least now. What we can do is the same coalition has broken down that big housing need into subgroups. And I would advocate strongly that we need all of the housing, but we particularly need cheaper types, whether it's tiny homes or shared housing options or something else like that. We need motel conversions and preservation, which the state has a fund now to do. And I think we need permanent supportive housing for folks with severe mental illness. And I say that because what has happened, which is one of our fears, was that if you can't get a housing outcome for folks through the shelter, they come in the shelter for a short amount of time, they go to housing, open up a bed, somebody else comes through, right? If you can't get that flow because there's not the housing, particularly folks with severe mental illness, they tend to stay in the shelters much longer than anyone else does. And they take a disproportionate number of bed nights. And that means that they're in the same bed every night, some of them every night since we opened 2 years ago. It's their housing at this point. And having 10 to 15 to 20, sometimes more folks with pretty significant acute mental health symptoms in there creates a very different dynamic in that building, right? It's even for a lot of other folks, it's uncomfortable. It's hard. The staff take a lot of time to manage those mini crises and that to keep it sort of safe in the center and feeling safe for folks so they come in, that they can't do a lot of other stuff sometimes. So moving that crew into housing that's appropriate to their needs with support long-term would do a major benefit to the resource centers themselves, get that flow going and open up capacity so we also could get more folks from the streets in. And the camping ordinance can start being effective again, along with we need more police, obviously, and those kind of things. So that's an overall concept about the housing push. The good things about housing right now is I have never seen in my career this much money or attention to housing. And generally what happens is to get a lot of policymakers, you know, myself included at the time, acting on something has got to go sort of beyond a crisis. And that's where we're at. So that we see it's so far gone right now for housing prices that the state put 50 million to match with 680 million or something from the private donors to a housing preservation fund this year. Federal stimulus is going to come down this fall for homeless funds, really targeted at services, but particularly about housing. Between the state, city, and county, there's a lot of money this fall for that purpose. And we're working together, all three of those entities, to have a coherent plan that we work together on so that we can be most effective with those monies. They're going to be about a 2-year duration to use those, 2.5 years. We've never seen this level of investment before. And so that's a very positive thing. We've got more data than we've had in the past. I think the system structure for the state is better than it's been in the past, particularly from the state level about coordinating an actual budget on that level that thinks about the statewide need as well as the local need. So there's some really strong things going forward here and strengths we can work off of, but we do have our work cut out for us in the near future, particularly. Too much?
It's a lot to take in. There's a question in the chat. Do you mind answering that? Can you see it, or do you want me to read it to you?
Let me pull it up here. Let's see, the webpage or the big question?
I guess they're kind of the same.
Okay. Yeah, so for camps, folks who are literally camping, the SLC mobile app is a great resource that goes right to Michelle Hune at the city, who's the manager of our services team. And she coordinates the health department, the outreach teams. Every week they talk about every single camp they get reported in the city, and that's a couple pages long. And they go through camp by camp and person by person, much as possible to figure out how to do that. So I would contact Michelle Hoon, and I think I saw Weston on here. Maybe we can put her information here, email. And then also the SLC app is a good resource. So we can track it really well. One of the dilemmas right now is that COVID has asked for smaller camps, but they're more spread out, which is problematic. But we also have the large camps that take up a lot of resource and time. We've had on particularly the river, Victory Road, Rio Grande, Fifth West, downtown, ballpark area, obviously, and a couple other hotspots depending on what's happened this year. So oftentimes they get a lot of attention because that's where the big number of folks are. We're working on a more detailed prioritization list of how to abate those camps more frequently. One of the difficulties we've had in doing that is the health department previously felt they did not feel comfortable going in without some police presence to do the cleanups. And so we had to have the health department resource available, Salt Lake City PD resource available at the same time to go in. And sometimes those haven't matched up very well or very quickly, and there's been some delays in there, combined with just about a 20% shortage in the police department, which you're aware of. So there's a number of factors that go into how quickly a camp can get addressed, but certainly same day, next day, pretty quickly, the outreach teams, if they don't know about it already, will be there and working to get services, engage them. But pretty quickly, we'll get more resources as soon as we can in there. Certain areas, we've been able to use things like the downtown ambassadors for support. They had the expansion into Rio Grande and then to North Temple, the eastern end of North Temple. Also looking at Central 9th and then Ballpark coming up quickly this year. I hope to get those ambassadors in those areas. And then Advantage Services for cleanups has been very valuable as well. And I'd love to see us continue to expand that service because they can be on the ground some days every day in some areas cleaning and helping sort of maintain stuff. So we don't get to the point where the health department has to come in with the big trucks and the backloaders and everything else because there's talking about tons of stuff there. We're still working to keep up on that.
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Thanks. Hi, Andrew. This is Caitlin from the Liberty Walls Community Council. I have a bit of a follow-up to that question, which is when you are finding people report these camps and asking people to move, do you find what happens after that? And is it actually just moving people from one place to another, from one community to another? What do you find when you do these camp abatements? Because it just seems like people get pushed around. And so I'm more interested in how we as a community can support people, given that there's no housing for them. And I didn't hear you talk a lot about or use the term housing first. So I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to your philosophy around housing first, getting people into housing without barriers, and is the limitation on that literally now just funding and housing?
Well, I apologize for not using the term housing first. It is definitely the foundational principle for the housing pushes we're talking about. From the Salt Lake Valley Coalition, it's written very clearly in their Housing Now plan. This is a housing first model. What we mean by housing first, for those who are less aware perhaps, is there's been periods in the past here and nationally where in order to get housing that was scarce, oftentimes, you had to go through a treatment program first. You had to be clean and sober or taking your medication a certain amount of time You had to have a job or something like that before you would qualify to get into an apartment, which meant you had to do a lot of work to get there, and a lot of folks couldn't do that. It wouldn't match up well, and it also made a hard time on service providers, because it's hard to do a lot of services with folks who have no place to be permanently. So even the ability to deliver a service like that was difficult from a provider perspective. So Housing First came out of a lot of research, particularly on the East Coast, where if somebody can get directly into housing, doesn't matter, they don't have to go through a shelter, they can go from the street to housing or anything else into housing. And that's the first priority, get them into a stable placement. Then you saw with some requirements, and one of the requirements oftentimes was you got to meet with your case manager frequently, regularly, to help problem solve, to work through issues that come up in your housing situation, your life situation, those kind of things, and deliver the services with that. So it's easier to deliver, say, substance abuse services when you know where a person's going to be, and they know how to get from their place to a treatment program, or the treatment program can come to them depending on what's going on. Same thing with mental health supports. It is much easier to help with on-site medication support if there's a place to go on-site. And that was found to be much more cost-effective in other municipalities, and actually here too, than previous models of sort of prove you want the housing more than somebody else and we'll give it to you. We did this very well about 15 years ago. We built 3 big complexes, and the homeless unsheltered population dropped significantly. The road home shelter census dropped significantly. And then we stopped. And there's a lot of factors historically what happened, but we proved that that works for that population of chronically homeless individuals. They get stabilized, their symptoms drop oftentimes just naturally from having a place to be at night. They can get more supportive services when things go wrong. And we can talk through that model a little more, but that's absolutely the core of the housing push we're advocating for. And there's been some pushback from some sectors, nationally a little bit, and some other places, but that's clearly our belief here. Now, as far as the abatements, yeah, the reality is there's not a place to go for folks. And so the abatements were about trying to limit the size of camps so that you don't have 30% of people coming in just to deal and do business around that camp. And you didn't get the underlying health problems over a period of time where the county would find rats, hygiene issues, significant hygiene issues with human feces and those kind of things. So it's been tough to sort of say we want smaller camps, but we don't have enough porta potties to go to every single little camp across the city. And it's easier to have a larger camp, but you have a hard time controlling what happens there after a while, right? So yeah, it's been a difficult dilemma from the city perspective of offering services to keep it safe and hygienic, but not really having an exit strategy at this point for this many people. Like I said, we're about 300 short. If we had a real flow through the system, we could get more flow through resource centers or other motel options into housing and free it up so people could come in. We just haven't had that. So it's been a rough road that way. I don't know if that answered everything you asked.
Yeah, I'm just curious more about, like, I'm much more curious on how we as a community council can support in the interim these populations, like what we could do to actually see them as part of our community rather than a nuisance.
Sure.
And also how to support the political will for massive funding for public housing, to just get more housing in the stock.
I think the first thing is there's generally a really big difference between 1, 2, 3, 5 people and 20, 30, 40 people, right? In a 1, 2, 3, 5 concept, a few tents, generally it's pretty quiet, pretty low issues, not always, but generally. I mean, but oftentimes that if they go into a new area, you know, sort of the outcry and the fear and all that, and it's understandable. But for the most part, folks don't want to sort of be in the spotlight a lot. And so they try and keep quiet and do that. So smaller camps, it's definitely helpful for the city to know where they are so we can deliver services. That's the first thing. But also just educating community members about how do we differentiate between sort of a law enforcement problem and a criminal problem and somebody who's sleeping. Because we can deliver services to help with the hygiene issues without, and clean up periodically. So it's just clean up the underlying sort of ground underneath and around the facility, and they go back and reestablish. The hard piece is as soon as it hits that threshold of 5 tenths, 10 tenths, you get a different dynamic happening there. And so I think helping us with reporting, the outreach teams, I don't know if they take volunteers, but definitely supplies are helpful. I mean, particularly in the summertime, water is a big deal. Basic needs that way. I think there's plenty of ways to donate and help, volunteer. We can do that. As far as doing, we know the activist groups are actively out there working on a lot of weekends particularly, but also some weeknights and delivering some services. And I can't sort of speak for them at all, but I know they do take volunteers. I'm always a little cautious because know what you're getting into when you do that. There's a wide variety of folks doing that sort of work, and some of them have a better sense of what they're doing than others are. And so it's always kind of tricky that way. Advocating, yeah, we need to advocate hard. I think it's hard to describe to other places in the state what's happening accurately to have them understand, because this is not a crisis elsewhere. And on the state level, legislators don't see it as a crisis other places. They see it as a Salt Lake City problem, and Salt Lake City should deal with it. So yes, there needs to be an awareness of the human impact of people being unsheltered and homeless. I think you'll see newspaper articles. This past weekend was Utah County. They've had a series of articles about their situation down there. And one of the statements that was made was a local official down there just said, well, there's never been a push for it. We never needed it, a shelter. And it's sort of like, as long as it's not visible, it's not a problem. Or as long as we enforce hard enough, they'll have to find a place to go, which is usually Salt Lake City. And so educating about your experience in a very humanistic way, like it sounds like you are, that these are people. They're not the criminals we're talking about. Criminals tend to come into larger camps a lot. If we had housing, they could be mentally ill and housed. Most folks who use substances are actually housed. They're not homeless. We tend to stigmatize the homeless because they're more visible and they can only use on the street. But all the data supports the more you make in the state, the more you drink, if you're a drinker. So it has much more to do with income than anything else. That's usually a reaction to your homeless situation. So there's a lot of education that way. So yeah, I think the one thing in Salt Lake City we have a hard time with is that we're represented by the Democrats, and they have very little sort of say, unfortunately, in larger policy issues. But I would definitely write. I write to the governor, even though he doesn't have a lot of say over the budget. From the Salt Lake City perspective, I think the other thing that we need to bring up a lot more than we do perhaps is at the county level. Mayor Wilson's been very good to work with, and she's donated staff to help with these things for years now consistently. But the county is a place also that the county council has authority over their budget, which includes behavioral health funding for mental health and substance use treatment. They have a lot of county health funding, which is deeply entwined with this. They also have housing funds. And so I don't think we advocate there nearly enough, as much as we do maybe at the city level and even at the state level, but it's going to take all three of those levels to help us get where we need to be. The other thing that I would say is that if housing is ultimately the answer here, and this is going to be a fraught discussion, I'm sure, but land use, not just the city, but the county. But in the city, we know that those are hard conversations to have about density and types of housing that goes in where, and is equitably shared across the city and all those discussions. But this could be potentially a place where some good middle ground could be had at the community council levels to understand different needs and how we integrate that more effectively within the city, across the city. Because we're going to do some housing here, regardless. We need to do it. We need to find the right places and the right support from communities to do that.